Previously on agentpalmer.com, Dylan goes electric, Dayton's hook, line, and sinker is completed, and while I may not be celebrating milestones like Chris, I am taking the time to look back at where I was to realize how far I've come. This is the Palmer Files, episode 53, featuring me, Agent Palmer, behind the microphone. As you'll hear in my own words, the unabridged story from blogger to podcaster with a few titles along the way. Are you ready? Let's do the show! Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and in this 53rd episode, I will take you on the unabridged journey from blogger to podcaster. My journey is not so simple as I have a blog, perhaps I should start a podcast too. That may work for others, but it was not my particular experience, as you'll soon hear. I have a few observations after working on this script and this episode, but that is for after the story. For now, let me explain why I am telling you this story in the first place. I wanted to tell this story because it poured right out of me. Here's the thing. I wrote this for a reason, but the intention was a few paragraphs of how this all came to be, because it comes up quite a bit. Podcasters talk about podcasting, and we're all fascinated with origin, but I wanted to end the cycle. I wanted to shorten the answer and point to this episode and the full script posted on my blog so I wouldn't have to say it again. Not on this show, not on others. So it started with the intention of it being a few paragraphs, but there is a big difference between a few paragraphs and a few pages. I wrote the first draft of this around episode 12, so it has been sitting for a while, and of course, it needed some tweaks since I've done almost 3 times as many episodes since the first draft was completed to when I finally decided to get this revised for publication and this recording. You are now going to hear the words that were revisited and revised. But before we get going, remember that if you want to discuss this episode as you listen or afterwards, you can tweet me at Agent Palmer and this show at The Palmer Files. Email can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. And remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer is agentpalmer.com. So, without further ado, how did we get here? It all started with a single guest spot, spawned into a sub-brand, and eventually led me to my own show. Let me explain how I became a podcaster after assuming various roles.
The blogger.
To be fair, it probably all starts with my blog, agentpalmer.com. On that blog, launched in November of 2011, I write about geek and nerd stuff from movies and books, sports and games, some current events, and on occasion a few personal things. Since anything can really be geeky or nerdy, I basically have carte blanche to write about anything, so I do. I identified myself as Agent Palmer, a blogger. That's what I was back in 2014, just a blogger listening to podcasts, when I got pulled into orbit around a specific podcast community like a lost asteroid. The podcast community was 7 Days a Geek, and I quite enjoyed the digital social interaction that I had with the show. Around this time, one of the co-hosts of that show, Grant Markham, was talking about the debut of his new solo effort, The Stranger Conversations. So, of course, I checked that out too. Podcast listening begets podcast listening. It's just the nature of podcasts. So, when a Twitter conversation led to an invitation to be a guest on Grant's new show, I said yes. At this point, being active in the sphere of that show, I got mentioned on mic a bit. At first, it was my full persona name, Agent Palmer. But it got shortened not too long after to either Palmer or, on a rare occasion, Harry, mainly by Grant, who knew the Ipcris File movie reference I had in mind when I created the persona in the first place. Before we recorded that episode, I was a bit nervous. I hadn't been on mic since my time on my college radio station, and that was almost exactly 11 years to the day of my recording with Grant in early April 2015. But despite the raw nature of that show, and the fact that the episode started when you picked up the Skype call, Grant, who is one of the most natural hosts and conversationalists I know, made me feel at ease. So the recording came and went, and I was feeling pretty good. The episode that released a few weeks later was well received, and with no further podcasting ambitions, I had assumed my podcasting career to be over. That recording was the first time anyone but me had used my name and persona together on mic, but they would meet only sparingly for a while. Grant titled the episode The Stranger Conversations Jason Stershik, but I politely asked that he add Agent Palmer to the title, and he did, because at least at that time on the internet, more people knew me as Palmer than Jason. Then, about a month later, I was invited on the Moving the Needle podcast. I assume based on my appearance on The Stranger Conversations, because no one invites a blogger to talk. I don't remember which of the hosts invited me on, but I was asked to discuss summer movies. Because I had brought Jurassic World into the conversation, the episode was titled Indominus Cruelty. Though that show has since been reincarnated by 3 of the original 6 hosts, it was my first introduction to Roy, Sean, and Henno. More on Henno later. After dishing on dinosaurs, the emails and invites dried up until something magical started to happen.
The Proxycaster.
After the long, dry summer of 2015, not much happened until October, when I was a guest on 3 shows. The GeekDig podcast, Inglorious Gentlemen, and Podcast Without Borders. I was also a producer and guest on 7 Days of Geek's first annual Podtoberfest that was later released in November. Later that month and through December, I was a guest on Diamond Mines, reappeared on 2 more episodes of Inglorious Gentlemen, plus recorded my first of what turned out to be many spots on Gotham Lights podcast and Our Liner Notes. 2016, as it turned out, would be more like the way the previous year ended. I was on 1 show in January, 2 in February, 2 in March, 4 in April, and 9 in May. Somewhere along the way, Bill Sweeney, host of the Wicked Theory podcast, coined the term Proxycast, and its accompanying definition being, Palmer doesn't need his own podcast, he has yours. Now, it wasn't all guest spots. I was also a guest co-host on shows like 7 Days of Geek, a producer behind the scenes on that show in addition to The Diamond Dave Show and Chronicles Unwritten. I was going through a number of titles behind the scenes of the Wicked Theory podcast, and the number of different shows I was infiltrating grew over time. Infiltrating may seem like a harsh word, but at this point I was really leaning into the spy-themed part of my brand. Besides the aforementioned shows, there were appearances on Passersby Podcast, Geek Up and Go, The Podcast Digest, Preacher vs. Preacher, a comparison companion podcast, Dark Angels and Pretty Freaks, Quadcast Podcast, Reasons Are Several, How Was Your Week, Honey, What's Your Work Podcast, Orville Lights, and Spybrary. Along the way, I became a producer and legitimate co-host working behind the scenes on 7 Days of Geek, The Wicked Theory Podcast, Our Liner Notes, and The Podcast Digest. But throughout it all, at least for a very long time, I maintained my Proxycaster status because I was helping out on other people's shows. These were not mine. Then, during the summer of 2019, I finally admitted to myself that I was, in fact, a podcaster. This happened because someone told me that by saying it's not mine, I was slighting the co-hosts with whom I shared the mics. After entertaining the idea of eventually launching my own show, I finally conceded to Henno Heitur of Moving the Needle and Gotham and Orville Lights that I was, in fact, a podcaster, a conversation that had been going on for years. Admitting to myself and to Henno that I was indeed a podcaster was the final step in a chronologically twisted tale. Following my time on mic with The Stranger Conversations, I listened to the remainder of Grant's first season. We became friends and began developing a vision for an eventual second season of that show. We talked about what he found fulfilling and what parts of the show we needed to keep. We agreed key elements needed to include the Stranger 10, a list of 10 questions Grant would ask each guest at the end of the show. In preparation for Season 2, we simultaneously tested the Stranger 10 with some friends in the podcasting world, as well as my role as a remote silent producer. I would join Grant's interviews via Skype to take notes, listen in, and on rare occasions contact Grant during the recording, but I was muted the entire time. Grant and I were determined to make this as professional a process as possible. Although we eventually recorded the first full episode of Season 2, life had other plans for us, and the project ended just after that unreleased recording.
The editor.
Enter Chris Maier, whom I occasionally co-hosted our liner notes with, and who has a show with his wife Kristin called How Was Your Week, Honey? Chris occasionally asked me about his recorded episode in just a "what's up with that?" nonchalant kind of way. Chris were going to miss a week of recording due to travel, and he wanted to know if he could release the unreleased episode of the Stranger Conversations with Grant on the How Was Your Week, Honey feed. I talked it over with Grant and came up with an idea. I suggested Chris could release the episode only if Kristin could be a guest on the Stranger Conversations first. After all, that was the original plan with Grant when he had stepped back from recording for the time being. I offered a one-time only scenario to substitute host for Grant on the Stranger Conversations with Kristin as a guest so that Chris and Kristin would both not only get their episodes recorded, but they would both be released. Grant agreed and sent me the file to edit the original show with Chris, which isn't something I ever offered to anyone before. It's not that I couldn't do it, it was just that I didn't want people to know that I had that skill set. It's important to note that as a communications major in college, my senior project was a 1-hour radio program based on a piece of biographical nonfiction that I had written. I drafted it into a script and recorded it in my dorm room, then edited the final thing together in Audacity. This was in 2003-2004, so I was surprised and relieved to note that Audacity was not only still a solid digital audio workstation, a DAW, but that it hadn't really changed in the decade since I had last used it. I proceeded to edit Chris's long-lost episode from Season 2 of The Stranger Conversations while I prepared to fill Grant's shoes for a one-time hosting gig as Agent Palmer. Chris released his episode and then Kristin's episode with me as host. Both shows were my first public edits of a podcast. Then we got together on an episode of How Was Your Week, Honey? To compare the answers that both Chris and Kristin gave during their Stranger 10 questions. The show was a success, and it reinforced my experience behind the scenes with other shows.
The producer.
Earlier in this out-of-control nonlinear story, I mentioned being a producer behind the scenes for a podcast. On the whole, most people have absolutely no idea what that means, and to a certain extent, I still don't because it varies from show to show. For a moment, let me do my best to consolidate all of the things I did as producer and list them for you. I have pitched guest possibilities, booked guest and fielded guest queries. I have written show notes and moderated chat rooms during live recordings. I have been an in-the-moment fact checker and a preliminary researcher. I have helped brainstorm bits, written scripts, planned events, and sought out ads and sponsors. Then there's the organizational management aspect of keeping show hosts on a schedule for recording dates and in-show elements, and then there's the entire piece of dealing with marketing, branding, and promotion. I'm proud of the producer credits I tallied up. The fine shows I worked with as some sort of producer include 7 Days of Geek, the Wicked Theory podcast, Preacher vs. Preacher, Our Liner Notes, Chronicles Unwritten, The Diamond Dave Show, and The Stranger Conversations. I've even helped with technical troubleshooting, which isn't easy considering none of these shows are in the same geographical area I'm in. The Wicked Theory podcast is the closest show to me, and that's at least 90 minutes away depending on traffic. Almost all of this work and technical troubleshooting was handled remotely, often across multiple time zones and sometimes internationally. To this point, I was a blogger, then a listener, then a guest turned serial guest to Proxycaster, then editor, producer, and eventually podcaster, and my own show was yet to be created. Since the beginning of the process of talking about Season 2 of The Stranger Conversations with Grant, I had been tossing around ideas in my head for what I would want my own show to be. There are plenty of people within the circle and others who asked why I didn't have a show of my own. While all of these experiences should have built up my podcasting confidence, the truth is that I clung to the Proxycast title like a life raft. Anyone who's had the pleasure of guesting on someone else's show knows how much fun podcasting can be when all you have to do is show up on the mic and talk. Truth be told, I had to ask many of the questions I forced others to answer as producer. What did I want to do? Should there be a format? How long will it be? How often will it come out? What happens, if anything, to my existing blog? What will it be called? I don't think I appreciated the pressure I put on other hosts until I had to ask those questions of myself. But as I embarked on trying to answer those questions, I realized that over time I had, at the very least, been asking the right questions.
Finally, the podcaster.
First and foremost, I knew I wanted my show to include one host plus a guest. I did a solo show for an episode of Spybrary. While I've done a few, it's not my preferred format. Since starting the Palmer Files, I have used solo episodes for particular purposes, but the show is better when I'm having a genuine conversation with an interesting person. I also knew that I didn't want a regular co-host because those I considered to join me were in different time zones, which would complicate scheduling with guests, and additionally, none of them had the time to do the requisite research and record. And lastly, I didn't like the idea of launching a show where I couldn't control the whole thing. I chose to name my show the Palmer Files Podcast based on my persona and brand as Agent Palmer, knowing that Agent Palmer and I, Jason Stershik, were one and the same by this point. What makes this intriguing is that it goes against almost all of the advice I give to others about naming podcasts, especially when it comes to ease of growth. Growth is easier to achieve in niche markets and topics. By naming my show The Palmer Files, I was making it hard to determine what the show is about, and in early mental descriptions of the show, I was moving away from a niche market, making it impossible for me to cover just one thing or discuss just one topic. But that's the nature of decision making. There are trade-offs. So I chose a show name I could effectively tie in with my existing brand, including my blog, but also utilizing the general naming convention as to not pigeonhole myself into a niche so I could host discussions and conversations with a variety of guests on a wide range of topics. When I finally committed to the idea, I decided to launch with 3 episodes completed. I also chose to not initially promote it because I figured I would get enough buzz from people talking about how I finally had my own show. Since there were, and maybe even are, plenty of people in the world who have no idea who I am, and since I had the ability to, I stacked the first 3 episodes to be a subliminal 3-part backstory for myself. The first episode talked about decision-making based on a book called The Dip with Bill Sweeney, who was the one who recommended the book to me. We discussed, among other things, the decision-making process for starting this podcast. The second show featured Kristin Maier, a fellow blogger, so we could talk about blogging, which was how this whole crazy saga all began in the first place. And the third involved Dan Lizette of the Podcast Digest to discuss my past of podcasting and proxycasting. All of these launch episodes provided an overview of how this show came to be, as well as who I was as a blogger before podcasting, what podcasting is, and what it means to me. I recorded the 3 episodes and then got to editing, while reaching out to my very talented friend Henno Heitur for some original music. After getting all of the episodes edited, I started to work up ideas on when this was actually going to go down. On September 10th, 2019, I was excited to release the very first episode of the Palmer Files, and have since released new episodes every 2 weeks. Since beginning the podcast, some patterns have emerged: process and origin, journey and chance, challenges, risks, and above all, storytelling. I enjoy getting to know how things happened and why they happened, and I've been enthralled by the capacity that everyone has to share those stories, even if they need a little help or convincing to do so. Since I have covered the when and how so thoroughly, I feel comfortable borrowing a quote from my fifth guest, Tristan, the anarchaeologist, about why I started podcasting. It was inevitable. To quote Tristan,
I had to make it. There was no choice in it. I had to make it. And that's what I feel is like so important about podcasting, is you almost have to feel like you have to make it. Like there's a relentless energy behind it. And I think that's it was always inevitable, Jason. Always inevitable. Always. Doomed to podcast.
Whether I was actually doomed to podcast or not remains a valid question. Whatever the case may be, all of the skills I have learned and circumstances that led me to create the Palmer Files has just leveraged my experiences and surprising technical know-how in a remarkable way. I'm so incredibly proud to hit publish every 2 weeks for a new episode, just as I've been proud to hit publish every week on my blog. I've enjoyed my time as Proxycaster and guest on various shows. I enjoyed my time behind the scenes of every show I've been able to help. I've enjoyed stepping into co-hosting roles and guest hosting. Taking ownership of my role in hosting my own show is just another step in the journey. Was it really inevitable? Perhaps it's just more poetic to look at it that way. So, why did I start podcasting? It was inevitable. Revisiting these words as I approached 2 years of the Palmer Files has given me the opportunity to look back at the journey for lessons learned and just sheer inspiration. I did this. At one point, this wasn't even in the cards, and now it's here and consistent. That my own work still inspires me is unexpected and welcome. Plus, I find that I still have the energy and enthusiasm to keep it going. I have talked a bit about writing when the fire is hottest, go with the inspiration when it strikes, and don't let up. It comes up often when I discuss my writing habits with the blog and my tendency to be drafted ahead of my scheduled posts. But with this podcast, when the guest is scheduled, it doesn't matter if I'm inspired. It's go time. And while I haven't started every episode inspired, I'm proud that most of the time you can't tell in the final product. I put a lot into each episode. Not all weeks are equal, as the previous sentiment states, but that doesn't mean there isn't pride. I'm giving you my all. And some weeks that is more than others, but it's still all there. I am giving you the best I can every other week, and I don't intend to stop. In just the 2 short years of this podcast, totaling 52 episodes, now 53 with this one, I have revealed more about myself on every level than I have in 10 years on the blog with over 600 posts. It's not that I started out to keep my personal life private. I just wanted to share in the things that I enjoy. But the audio medium is very different. Even if I'm just talking about something I love, you can't help but give yourself away. It's not just in the words, it's the tone. It's the measured pause to take a breath. It's the delivery. All of that make audio a much more personal endeavor. None of that is to say that I prefer one format over the other. They have both become a part of who I am. But this right here is about the Palmer Files podcast. Something that, I cannot reiterate enough, I never really thought I would do, especially before I took that first step. And now, I can't imagine not doing it. I have reached out to friends, family, and strangers alike on the journey thus far, and since I enjoy talking to different people, the friends and the family part will dwindle in numbers because repeat guests are a rarity, and I only have so many friends and family. Though I have a few ideas on that front as well. I can't actually say what's coming, but I didn't really plan out how I got here either. So I launched the show and then started looking for guests and continue to. Then I reach out and invite people on. Some say yes, others maybe, some no, and others you never hear back from. And while I'm at it, I'm not upset at the people that have said no, maybe, or ghosted me. I pride myself on doing all of the invitations behind the scenes. I personally don't like the idea of doing it in public because it puts undue pressure on the ask. But I don't just ask for guests. Sometimes I ask people for help, which is why you heard the different voices for the subheads. Remember when I said originally that this was formatted for text? Well, subheads work really well in text form, but they don't typically work well in audio because, well, they are a visual construct. So I decided that I would utilize some of the voices that have been around me, and I have to tell you, they aren't random. They correlate to the section they're introducing, but it's so much more than that. This show may be a solo endeavor. It's me sitting down with a guest, reaching out to the guest, booking the guest, recording the guest, editing the show, creating the intros and outros, writing the show notes, hitting publish, marketing, and all that. But while it is a solo endeavor, it is not a solo effort. So whose voices were they? Well, I'm glad you asked. They are all in some way a help or inspiration or support system for not just this episode, but this podcast as a whole. Chris Hughes introduced the blogger section because he was and is the most prolific editor behind the scenes of that blog. And he's been around since before there was an Agent Palmer. Bill Sweeney introduced the Proxycaster section because he literally coined the term for me. Kristin Maier introduced the editor section because it was her and her lovely How Was Your Week, Honey co-host Chris that got me back into the audio editing suite. Grant Markham introduced the producer section as I unofficially credit him with introducing producer Palmer to the world, and as you've just heard in the episode, he's an integral part of the inspiration of this story and this podcast. Henno Heitur introduced the podcaster section because whether or not I was a podcaster, while I hid behind the Proxycaster moniker, was a lighthearted, ongoing conversation with Henno across multiple podcasts and platforms. These 5 plus others have done many more things which have supported, nurtured, and inspired the Palmer Files podcast. Again, it may seem like a solo effort, but this isn't just me. I do have help. Even if I'm doing all of the machinations, support comes in many ways, and I do get it. But back to the story that I just told you. It's not just that I have personally been a blogger, proxycaster, editor, producer, or podcaster. Any of those titles or hobbies or skill sets can be a destination in itself for you. For me, they just happen to be stops along the way. Well, what about success? Well, success for me isn't measured by money. That would be too easy. For me, success is measured in pride, and there is a lot of pride to go around. It is not a zero-sum game. So, whether you are
A blogger.
Proxycaster.
Editor.
Producer. Podcaster.
or any combination of them, know that as long as you take pride in your work, your hobby, your project, then you are a success. And remember, every journey has a start and an end, and the length in between varies from project to project, person to person, journey to journey. So, where are you? Are you on the path just starting out or ending? And how is it going for you? Let me know. Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files, episode 53. As a reminder, all links are available in the show notes, and now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can tweet me at Agent Palmer and this show at The Palmer Files. Email can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. And remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer is agentpalmer.com. honest with you. I'm riffing right here. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm not going to ask myself a final question. That would be cheeky. I'm also not scripting anything because I was like, I should put something at the end, but I don't know what it's going to be. But here's what it's going to be. It's going to be a heartfelt thank you. Because I do this for myself, but there's something special about sharing it with others and knowing that you're enjoying it. That's all there is. It's extra. I hit publish on blogs all the time that I know are read by some, and that's enough. And I hit publish on this podcast, and I don't know all of you that are listening, but some of you are. And I can't tell you how much it means to me that you're consuming this content I'm creating. It would mean even more if some of the silent majority that's listening would reach out, but that's not everybody's bag. I understand that. I don't reach out every time I consume a podcast. I should. We should all be in better practice. You read a book, let the author know you enjoyed it. You watched a movie, tweet the actor. You listen to a podcast, let the podcast know. Content creators don't always work in a vacuum. We often hear the negative loudly, and they're often so loud we don't hear the positive. But we can hear the positive. We do see it, and we feel it. And I just thank you. You don't have to reach out. I think you should. Not just for me, but for anybody else you're listening to. And if you've made it this far, like, super congratulations. I know I put something at the end here all the time. Not everybody still understands that, even after I did the whole episode based on this. So, again, this was a jumble of words and emotions. It has been over 2 years now. Thank you.